One of the biggest issues facing the Chinese economy and the world economy is often considered to be China's banking system. There's no shortage of bears on the topic, whether they are a world-famous hedge fund manager or a student of economics. Depending who you talk to, China's banking system is either a crisis waiting to happen or it's nothing to see here. Move along, please. We're delighted today to have somebody in the very latter camp, Mr. James Stent, who is unusual in that he was a foreigner who has extensive experience actually working for Chinese banks in China. He served on the board of two banks, Mencheng Bank and Everbright Bank. And he is very much, shall we say, a contrarian to the viewpoint that China's banks are a crisis waiting to happen. Jim today will argue that the bears have missed a transformation in the financial system. He will argue that the obsession with non-performing loans misses the strengths and overlooks the tools that authorities have to prevent defaults. And Jim has just published his argument in a new book called China's Banking Transformation, The Untold Story, published by Oxford University Press, which is available for sale at the front of the dining room here. So Jim is going to put out the case for why the West is wrong in China's banks. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A where everyone is very welcome to put questions to Jim, including the students, at the end of it. So without further ado, I invite Jim to take the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Enda. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be here today and share my thoughts with you. The mainstream consensus for the last 15 years on Chinese banks has been overwhelmingly negative. They are generally considered to be awash in bad debts, fragile, likely to collapse, and possibly bring down the economy in a hard landing as that happens. So I put on the screen here just 4 examples out of hundreds I could have chosen of the critical comments that have been made, starting not up here, but the critical comments really began with Gordon Chang in 2001, the coming collapse of China. And then it was reinforced by a interesting book, Red Capitalism, by Fraser and Howey. It came out in about 2009. And I've just put up here a few quotes from the last 5 years, 2 from the media, 1 from a credit rating agency, and 1 from an esteemed Nobel laureate in economics. Now, while I was spending a total of 13 years from 2003 to 2016 as an independent director, first of the China Minsheng Bank, which is one of China's few nationwide privately owned banks, and then of the China Everbright Bank, which is majority state-owned, I was seeing a really dramatic transformation of Chinese banks from legacies, moribund relics of the old planned economy of the Maoist era into effective financial intermediaries that in most areas were functioning in accordance with global best practice in banking. So there was this extraordinary dichotomy between what I was reading and what I was seeing with my own eyes and actually participating in a very small manner. And I thought a lot about that. And I realized that most of the foreign critics, skeptics, were missing the transformation that I was seeing, which I can understand that they would miss it because Chinese banks are not open. You want to go in and learn about Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, if you're a journalist, you can get interviews with a whole number of people at different levels. You cannot do that with a Chinese bank. They're rather opaque. But even more important, the Western critics were not understanding that the whole financial system behaves differently because of a totally different political economy context. Now, in the last few months, there have begun to be a few investment analysts and media have begun to take a cautiously more optimistic view on Chinese banks, but it nonetheless seems to me that they still are not really understanding the different context in which Chinese banks operate. So I decided to write a book about this. And in that book, I advanced 3 propositions. Number 1, that China's banks have indeed gone through a night and day transformation, and that I actually saw most of that from 2003. The transformation began slightly before that, around 1999. And I would say the really major transformation was probably finished by about 2010, when Agricultural Bank listed on the Hong Kong stock market. Since then, it's no longer been transformative, it's been evolutionary, continuing to improve, because it's still very much a work in progress. There's still many areas that Chinese banks need to improve in. My second proposition is that Chinese banks are deeply embedded in a political economy which is very different from any Western political economy. And the third proposition is that that political economy is in turn embedded in a totally different set of cultural values. So let's look first at this night and day transformation. I'm going to be rather brief on this, but you're welcome to question me or challenge me on this in the discussions afterwards. Essentially, Zhurongji in the late 90s was faced with a banking system that was still operating under government planned lending quotas. Many of the debtors, many of the state-owned enterprises didn't even know they were supposed to pay back debt. And the total NPL ratio is generally estimated to have been about 40%. So these were all technically bankrupt institutions. He sent teams around the world to understand how good banking systems work. And they came back and they said, well, banking systems are essential for any economy to grow and develop. And to reach the goals that we have set for the Chinese economy, we have to have a well-functioning system of banking. Chinese banks also can topple an economy. Witness Thailand, Indonesia, 1997. So Zhurongji set in motion this transformation, which the details of which are available in my book. I would just like to give you a few key points out of it from my own experience. When I joined the Minsheng Bank in 2003, the board of directors didn't really know what a board of directors was. They didn't have boards of directors back in the days of Mao. So it was a new thing, much less what an independent director did, or board committees did. So that was something that had to be developed with a great deal of support from the CBRC and from Western advisors, World Bank, et cetera. Corporate governance was the first thing that had to be installed. Second was risk management. The Chinese banking system had been technically bankrupt. How do we avoid that? How do we make sure we never again have to do a bailout on that scale? So that comes down to risk management, and in risk management it was prioritized. The first risk would be credit risk, and after that you go into a whole bunch of other risks that were gradually addressed over the course of time. Audit and internal control. When I came onto the board of Everbright Bank in 2006, I was made chairman of the audit committee, which is a wonderful job to have because it gives you license to look into any part of the bank. Well, the problem was that the newly created audit department didn't know how to do an audit. And they had bad relations with management, and they couldn't explain to the board of directors how the internal control system, how adequate it was, or where the weaknesses were. Well, by 2010, they had, with great diligence and great enthusiasm, they had taken on board what an internal audit department should do. They were relating effectively with senior management, and it had become an indispensable tool for the board of directors in understanding where our risks lay. IT, speaking with IBM, Hewlett-Packard, others who were involved in IT in China, they've all assured me Chinese banks' IT are ahead of Western banks. Very simple reason. Western banks are held down by legacy systems and often patchwork systems that result out of mergers of banks. China has had the advantage of being able to leapfrog, get the latest in technology. And I don't think I have to tell you about China's abilities in digital finance in the payments area, which is leading the world. So the large banks, which is the 5 big banks, Bank of China, Construction Bank, ICBC, Agricultural Bank, and Bank of Communications, plus the 12 joint stock banks, of which I sat on the boards of 2 of them, they're the 17 nationwide commercial banks. and they are in reasonably good shape today. Banks beneath that level, a lot of the criticisms you see of Chinese banking, when you actually dig into it, we're talking about some of the weaker, smaller regional players. They are very much a work in progress. A few of them, like Bank of Beijing, are outstanding. Others got a long way to go. But even, I just want to repeat, even in the really big and best developed banks, they are still on a learning path. Let me move on now to this issue of political economy of China is embedded in a totally different set of cultural values from European and North American. Now, everything on this slide is something all of you, ladies and gentlemen here, already know. So I beg your forbearance in repeating it here because it does affect how banks work in China, and we often forget that. Very simple. Simply, if you take US as an outlier in one area and China as over on the other end of the spectrum, the US is all about individualism. We think government, in the words of Ronald Reagan, is the problem, not the solution. We constrain government. We do it through our constitution. We do it through any number of mechanisms. And we believe that the market should solve problems. China, it's all about the group. Goes back to times of Confucius and before that. Starts with family, jia, and it's all about your responsibilities to society, your duties, your obligations. The US is all about freedom, liberty, and rights. Totally different approach to how you organize society, society's relationship with government, etc. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but just to make the point clear. Now, a very good book was written about 3 years ago called Fragile by Design by two professors that discusses how every banking system in the world is unique and idiosyncratic and arises out of its own national historical development and its own cultural values. And a very interesting example they give is the United States and Canada, who have very different historical development paths. The United States, since the founding of the Republic, has had something like 14 banking crises. It could almost be said we like banking crises because they are part of Schumpeterian creative destruction, and they get rid of the weak and they allow us to move on. That's the way America works. It's been highly successful for America. Canada has had one banking crisis. That was in 1839. They did not like it, so they haven't done it again. They have a highly regulated banking system that is, I think, one of the best in the world. Which system does China look upon with greater favor? You can guess the answer to that. So the Chinese cultural underpinnings, and again, which I discuss in much greater detail in my book, are essential to keep in mind as we look at the political economy and also at the banking system. The political economy that arises out of Chinese culture. I'm just going to list three what I call structural elements of it that affect the banking system, and then two characteristics of the political economy that I think are particularly important and often not well understood. Number one, the Chinese like to say they have market socialism, and this often brings an amused smile to the face of Westerners. But I think it's a rather apt description of their system. In America, we have market capitalism. Germany, Japan, countries like this have something in between, variously called cooperative capitalism, collaborative capitalism, and other names. In America, market forces are supreme. They're almost sacrosanct. We, of course, from time to time intervene, but with a certain guilty conscience. We have TARP. We bail out General Motors. We do this kind of thing. But then we quickly withdraw to let the market take over again. In China, China now thoroughly understands market forces. And they went so far as in the third plenum in 2013 to say market forces are decisive. But what they meant by that and what we overseas thought they meant by it are quite different. Because for the Chinese, market forces are a means, not an end. The Chinese do not believe markets solve all problems. They believe that the objective is not the market. The objective is building wealth and power for the nation and the people. And they are well convinced that things like competition, laws of supply and demand, marginal pricing, all these things you learn in Economics 101, that they are effective tools. But they're not the end all. So China then, therefore, has what I call a hybrid banking system. It's partially market and it's partially socialist. How does that actually play out? If you ask Jamie Dimon why he goes to work in the morning, he will say, very simple, to make profits, build shareholder value, and pay me a big bonus. If you ask the chairman of a Chinese bank, or you read the chairman's message in the annual report, it more likely than not begins with, dear shareholders, I'm pleased to report that in the year past, your bank has successfully supported national economic development goals, and it's also delivered an X% return to shareholders on the bottom line. 2 goals, a hybrid thing. Now, that makes the Bank of China's chairman's job a little more complicated in some ways than Dimon's, because he has to keep 2 masters in view. The bottom line is used by the party, by the government, to gauge your effectiveness. How efficient an institution are you? If you can't produce a good profit at the level of your competitors, then maybe we need to change the head of the bank. So you've got to keep your eye on the bottom line. Hence, surprisingly, vigorous competition between banks which are ultimately owned by the same shareholder, the state. At the same time, you are, as a CEO of a Chinese bank, almost certain to be a party member. There are few exceptions. And as a party member, you are imbued with a sense that you are serving the national development interest. In the past, this has not generally been too difficult to reconcile these 2 goals. In the future, it may become more difficult because of One Belt, One Road, which we can go into in the question period if you're interested in that. Now, is China unique in this, and is this strictly a Chinese communist thing? Well, in the book, I devote a chapter to that question. And first thing I do is I look at Chinese banks in the Republican period, 1920s, 1930s. Basically the same. They were hybrid banks, and they mouthed exactly the same sorts of philosophies of what banking was all about. You go back to the late Qing dynasty when the Chinese modern banks were first set up, exactly the same. The first one, the Daqing, was set up to fund industrial development of China, and they hired a Hong Kong and Shanghai bank Englishman to run it so that they'd be sure to run it in proper banking style. Nothing's changed in 100 years, really. And as far as being unique, no. If you look at Korea under Park Chung-hee, very much the same thing. He's alleged to have said, I don't want too many banks. I want to get all the CEOs around one dinner table so I can tell them what to do. And the results of this are fairly evident from Korea's phenomenal success. Taiwan, very similar. And Japan, Meiji Japan, a development state. In post-war Japan, very much strong government guidance of the banking system and of the whole economy to rebuild the country. They got all these ideas from a German economist that some of you may not have heard of, named List, who in the early 19th century wrote a counter to Adam Smith. And he said, Adam Smith's all very good for those Englishmen, but it won't work for us Germans who are lagging behind. So he said the state has to be heavily involved in development of the country, and that's what Bismarck did in 19th century development of the country. So what China is doing it's not unique. It's been done elsewhere and very successfully. Singapore's another country that adopts that kind of thing. Second structural characteristic of the Chinese political economy, which is totally different from America, there is no way to possibly compare the Democratic or Republican parties with the Communist Party of China. They are entirely different beasts. And you all, I think, have probably read McGregor's excellent book on the party and understand what it does. But I'd like to focus on one area down on the bottom of this slide, the organization department, the largest human resources department in the world. And I would argue that within the banking sector, at least, it does quite a good job. The people that I have worked with in the management of two banks have been well qualified. People I've met in other banks I thought were very well qualified for their jobs. But what it means is that if you are the CEO of a Chinese bank, you are paid by that bank while you're at that bank. But ultimately, who do you work for? You work for the Communist Party. And they will suddenly decide you are going to be transferred from Everbright Bank to go over to Construction Bank. And you go. And this is an area where Western corporate governance does not apply in Chinese banks. Nominally, it does. But in fact, it's the organization department that makes the decisions. And even in the private banks, the organization department will have to at least agree on who is appointed to be CEO of the banks. Third structural aspect of China's political economy is the power of the state. And this is really key. A lot of you have questions, I'm sure, about NPLs and how do we solve shadow banking and all kinds of things. We underestimate the ability of the state to affect economic outcomes when they decide to do so. Now, often, they don't decide to do so for an awfully long time. And that has to do with prioritization, or it has to do with building consensus within the government that they want to move on something. And I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. But the Chinese government, it doesn't lack for money. The national balance sheet of China is extremely positive. So these ideas that a local government is going to go bankrupt like Detroit or Stockton, California, first of all, they don't have a federal system. It's all sovereign risk. And second of all, it's state banks lending to state-owned companies or to other aspects of the state, units of the state. And the money is there. It's a matter of how you move it around. As I said earlier, through party networks, the government can communicate down to all the people in the state enterprises, in government departments, and to the banks, the general strategies and directions in which they want the country to move. It's reasonably nuanced. Often we think they all give a directive, but it's a little more subtle than that. It's in terms a little more akin perhaps to window guidance. Now, having said that, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the government is all policy wonks who do nothing but think about policy. Obviously, we all know there's corruption, and there are massive vested interests who are fighting against rational policy outcomes, which often is one of the things that accounts for very slow decision-making. There is politicking between factions. All of this exists as it does in any political system in the world. But the Chinese government, I think, is quite good at ultimately developing policies, plans, and getting them implemented. And they have the advantage that they don't have to worry about at this next Congress that the equivalent of a Trump is going to come up and undo everything. Because whoever is appointed to succeed Xi Jinping in 5 years from now will have been vetted and chosen by the present leaderships and will have been involved in developing these strategies that are done. So now I'd like to suggest two characteristics that I think are extraordinarily important. One is it again brings a smile to people's faces because this was the slogan of the Hu Jintao period, 和谐社会, the harmonious society. But it's serious. It involves avoiding risk. You want things to go smoothly. You want it to be stable, 稳定. You fear disorder. You fear chaos. You fear things getting out of control. That's luan, and Chinese fear that. So they're very cautious. The main mandate given to the board of directors and the two banks I served on was avoid risk. We don't want you running to us to bail you out again. Similarly, in the adoption of policy, they go very slowly. And I'll give an example of that. They fear Big Bang. So if Xi Jinping had been in charge of unrolling Obamacare in the United States back 5-6 years ago, he might have started with a pilot project in a remote county in Montana and seen how it went, and he would have found the computer system collapsed. So he then would have had that fixed, and he'd try it again in San Diego and found new problems with it. Until finally it was really going pretty well, and then he would cautiously roll it out nationwide. Well, of course, you can't do that in America. Obama had no choice. He couldn't go that route. But that's the way almost all policies are implemented in China, with occasional exceptions when they have to move with extraordinary speed, such as the 2008 stimulus. So they do not like big bangs. We Westerners, particularly we Americans, if you've identified a set of problems and you've got a solution, then just go do it. Don't waste time. Clean up the problem. Whatever side effects that have, we'll deal with that later. Chinese don't do that. Go very slowly, go back, reconsider, adapt it, improve it, etc. Very true in the financial area, but it's also happening in environmental policy. They're doing pilots on things all over the country, often totally under the radar screen. We don't even see they're doing it. So when we Westerners say, the third plenum, 60 resolutions, where's the action? It all sounded good, but where's the action? A lot of action is actually happening, but it's in pilots, it's in very low-key stuff, and gradually gaining momentum. The next thing that I think is very important is, and this is something Stephen Roach in his wonderful book, Unbalanced, really emphasizes, the Chinese do strategy at a national level. Americans do strategy beautifully at the corporate level. We don't believe in national strategy. Alexander Hamilton tried to do it, but that's not, we don't follow his way of doing it. We let the market decide on the strategies, let it sort itself out. Chinese strategy tends to be totally non-ideological, very pragmatic. Whatever works, that's what we'll do. If it's not working, we'll change it. They get extraordinary amount of expert input. They analyze what people want. In a strange way, they are, I would say, democratic. They're responsive to what the majority of the demos, of the people, what they aspire to, because they want to stay in power. So they have to deliver what most people want. Not what individuals want, but what the broad masses want. Strategic formulation can take a very, very long time. I was on the side involved with an NGO in China, so I was aware of the problems of foreign NGOs. Well, China has thought about how to license foreign NGOs for about 20 years. And finally, they went and did it last year, and they solicited a great deal of input. Including from foreign NGOs, what in the draft law was going to work, what wasn't going to work. So the implementation can be frustratingly slow, but it is steady and sure, and it eventually happens. Now, people then say, are they really interested in reform, or are they just interested in growth for the sake of stability? The answer is both. Chinese are masters at handling contradiction, masters at handling ambivalence, masters at yin and yang. They know that the party cannot remain in charge of China, and China cannot develop if it doesn't reform. But at the same time, it can't reform if it doesn't have national stability. So they have to deliver both at once. Which they emphasize at any particular time is constantly changing depending on the situation. Housing market, very good example. You'll see an article in the FT or the New York Times saying, they're clamping down on mortgages, making the requirements more strict. And then 6 months later, they released those requirements. Well, the strategies remain the same all through, but how much weight you give to a particular aspect of the strategy at a particular time depends upon the situation you're confronting at that particular time. So, as I said, China's had a transformation, but there's still plenty of issues. Not too many issues, I would maintain, with the nationwide banks. Obviously, they are working very hard to continually improve in every respect, but they're in reasonably good shape. As I said, lower tier banks need a lot of work. Guo Shuqing, coming in as CBRC, I think he's got to worry about lower tier banks. And that's where a lot of the problems we read about are occurring. Some of the heavy dependence on shadow banking, interbank lending and all, is coming from city banks in places like Jilin, Heilongjiang, up in the Rust Belt. All Chinese banks need to develop the ability to analyze private sector risk. They have no experience in this. It doesn't take much brilliance to lend to a state-owned enterprise, whether it's a zombie or not. It's sovereign risk. There is no more risk-free investment for bankers any place in the world than your own country's sovereign risk. You lend to SOEs, one way or another, you will get paid back, or you will get most of it back. But the private sector, the government's probably not going to bail you out. And you have to take into account a whole bunch of things you didn't have to take into account in lending to local governments or into SOEs. You have to be able to analyze cash flow and analyze it in companies that probably have more than one set of books. If you can't analyze the quality of an SOE's management team, it doesn't matter, because if it's not any good, the organization department will put in a new organization, a new management team. But with private sector, you've got to be able to analyze the character and capabilities of management. I spend a lot of time talking to account managers in our banks in branches all over China, looking at some of their accounts that they were managing, actually looking at the files. What I found was these were very bright, very diligent, and very eager young people, but they were young. The good credit managers and risk managers in HSCB, in Standard Chartered, in these places, they have gray hair. They've been through crashes. They can mentor the young, bright people. The mentors are not there in the Chinese banks, so this is a real weakness, and it's one which I think the Chinese banks don't yet recognize, because China's economy still does very well. But NPOs are rising in this area, and they need to watch out for this. Shadow banking, a lot of problems. SOEs, they need to be improved. I think that is happening. Digital finance, whole new area in which there needs to be work done. Capital markets in disarray. Equity, bond markets, insurance. We just arrested the head of the Insurance Commission a few months ago. Huge amount of work to be done there. Let me just give one example here and then wrap up and go into discussion. Right now, for those of you who follow finance, you will see there's a whole slew of regulations coming out in all areas of finance, each one in a small area. And they are tightening up on risk. Includes shadow banking, digital banking, P2P lending. It includes the arrest of the head of Anbang and people like this. What is clear to me is that while we have all identified these problems and thought they were potentially going to destabilize the Chinese banking system and economy, the Chinese leadership was getting the same input. These are risks which will become systemic risks if not addressed. So in April of this year, Xi Jinping called his chief economic people in the Politburo together with the chief regulating people, about a dozen people around a table, and he went on nationwide TV and he gave them about a 12-minute lecture, and he said, effectively, get financial risk under control. Now, he doesn't come out and say that because he dreamed it up that morning. This is the result of a very deep-seated consensus developing at policy levels in the Chinese government. He then comes out and says, now, these are your marching orders. And he gets them all together because he wants to make it clear he's not just talking about insurance or just talking about equity. It's got to be done as a team effort. In July, you had the financial, whatever they call it, the 5-year financial conference of the leaders, and it then formalized how they were going to do this. But that conference was simply formalizing what had probably been discussed for 2 years, I would guess, but at least for 1 year among all players involved. And as a result, everybody is now step by step tightening up. Now, if it was the US, we would issue a new law, a Dodd-Frank Act or something like that, which would be a big bang. From now on, you do it this way. But that would be disruptive. It might freeze up credit. So the Chinese way will be to do it step by step. It'll probably unfold actually over years. And the problems, the risks we've identified won't disappear overnight. They'll gradually get under control, and they will be changed based upon experience as we go along. I think the key issue to think about in the future of Chinese banking system, and indeed China as a whole, is not the economic problems. In my view, given the power of the state that I've discussed and the other things I've discussed, I think all the economic problems that are being talked about, the overall debt level, shadow banking, all these things, there's solutions, technical solutions for all of them. The key issue is the one that David Shambaugh has focused on in his article in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago and in his latest book. Does China's political economy, does the leadership of the party retain the flexibility and pragmatism to tackle these problems, to adapt to a constantly changing reality? Is it still have that capability, and will it have that capability in the future? If it does, then I am reasonably optimistic that all these problems can be solved and China will do reasonably well. Given what's happening in the last few months on finance, that's evidence that they are still quite responsive. If your answer to that question is, as David Shambaugh's is, no, they are getting into the last stages of the dynasty, then it's not the economic problems that are going to be the real issue. It's going to be political and social problems. So I would just leave you with a couple of thoughts as you go about your work of reporting on the Chinese economy. Don't use what Stephen Roach calls a Western lens to look at it. Keep in mind, it's not a market capitalist economy, so you can't use market capitalist tools to understand it. It is a market socialist economy. You have to get into that mindset. And also assume that Chinese leaders probably have seen all these problems before we do, and that they're already working on solutions. And if they haven't brought forth the solutions yet, it's because they haven't gotten up to the top level in their prioritization, or they're developing consensus, or they're dealing with vested interests, or something else. So if you see a problem, say, given the way China works, are solutions available to solving it or not? And then see, do they take those solutions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Jim has agreed to take some questions before we wrap up. If there are any from the floor, we have just here at the back. Please give your name and your organization. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tohan Shi from MLEX. Following what you said about corruption, I mean, do you see corruption as a very serious risk for China's banking system, where corrupt officials order banks to lend money to companies operated by their relatives or friends, you know?
Question I'm often asked, very good question. First of all, my background prior to getting involved with Chinese banks was in Thai banks. And I worked in a Thai bank from 1984 to 2002. And I similarly saw a transformation of Thai banks, although much less dramatic than in China. Corruption was an enormous problem in the Thai banking system prior to 1997, and indeed throughout Southeast Asia. Under the table payments were almost part of the system, and it was very difficult to stop that. So I had this very much in my mind as chairman of the audit committee. Needless to say, it was something I worried about. And I frequently asked about this, and I'm sure it exists. But it was not something that people talked about very much. They said, yeah, it's true to exist, but we don't see it, we're not really seeing it as one of our major problems. Now, after this anti-corruption campaign got started, I've been watching very closely to see how many bankers got wrapped up in this. And industry after industry, it started with the energy industry, probably because of Zhou Yongkang's involvement in that. But then it proceeded, one industry after another was attacked. And to date, after almost 5 years of this, we don't really see very much happening in the banking sector. There are a few bankers have been caught up. Most notably, Mao Xiaofeng, the CEO of Minsheng Bank, but he got caught up on a technical corruption thing, but the real reason everybody knows was because he was the protege of Hu Jintao's secretary, Ling Jihua. And Ling Jihua put him in there, and he also put his mistress in and various other things. So poor Mao Xiaofeng is in jail. There was one director of the Bank of Beijing, which is a really outstanding bank, and he was arrested, but it was because he was also involved in he was an outside director who was on some part of the Beijing energy apparatus and was caught up in the whole Zhou Yongkang thing. So nothing to do with the bank. There have been a few other arrests, but given the fact 1 million people, I think, have been hauled in to date in this thing, not many bankers. Now, you could explain this, that banking is regarded as such a sensitive area that they don't want to rock people's confidence in it, might play part of it. I, of course, would like to think that we bankers are innately honest people, but that probably is not true. It could, though, be that Zhu Rongji's cleansing of the banking system did result in the best and the brightest going into the banking system. If I was writing a book about another part of the Chinese economy, it would not be nearly as positive as it is on the banking system.
Thank you. Just a question on the end, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sheridan Presso. I work for Bloomberg News. I wanted to ask you for some more details about solving the problem of the banks at the city and provincial level, where, as you mentioned, there's quite a number of problems. What sorts of solutions are we going to see, and will they be effective? What sorts of solutions do you think we're going to see, and can they be effective?
Well, the first problem with the city banks and the cooperative banks and all of those, and there are more than 100 city banks, and there are literally thousands of these cooperative banks and microfinance organizations, et cetera. The big problem with them is that most of them are owned not by the central government, but they're owned by provincial or city governments, and therefore not as directly amenable to control. And city and provincial governments often have a great deal of sway over the management teams because they dominate the boards of directors. And another problem with the local banks is if you're a national bank, like China Everbright Bank, you disperse your risk across a vast country and a vast economy. So I remember about 6-7 years ago, I came to Hong Kong, met with analysts, and they said, your NPL ratio hasn't gone up very much, but we know for a fact that many, many of your clients in Zhejiang province have small exporters have gone under. Why isn't it showing up in your numbers? So I went back and I asked the bank, and they said, well, it is going up. NPLs have risen by 10 basis points. But the total exposure to that one area was very small, and therefore it's swamped by other parts of China. So often we look at a particular region and try and deduce a big picture out of it, and in fact, it's only for that region. But if you're the bank in that region, it can be devastating. So they can get very hard hit, as indeed Rust Belt banks up in the Northeast are. How are they going to solve this? Well, despite the different government levels of ownership, they all belong to the party ultimately. So I would think it's through party channels and through the CBRC's ability to be a much more proactive regulator than is the Fed or the Bank of England. They really come in and tell you not just what you can't do, but what you should do in a very positive and constructive way. Why haven't they done it before this? I think one of the things the Chinese do very well is prioritize. They know if you try and change everything at once, you change nothing. So they started in the beginning with the then 4 big banks. Then they do the joint stock banks. And now they do the most important, systemically significant city banks that are going to be easiest to do, like Bank of Beijing, Bank of Shanghai, and eventually they get to the Bank of Jilin and Ningxia. So it may take another 10 years to get that done, but I do believe it's on the agenda. Now, people often ask me, well, what if one of them goes belly up before then? Well, if it goes belly up, no matter how diligent as reporters you are, I suspect you'll never even know it. Because by the time it goes belly up, they will quietly merge it with somebody else or change the management team, recapitalize it, and you'll never even know it happened. That's the way they handle problems in China.
Oh, okay, so one last question, please, round two.
Andrew Collier, Orient Capital Research. Thank you for the very good presentation. I'm a former president of a division of the Bank of China, and I will admit my colleagues were not as optimistic as you are about the situation. On the ground level, they are constantly recategorizing loans as category 3 instead of 4 in order to avoid NPLs. Plus, as you mentioned, that the fact that the state versus the non-state metrics means that they're being forced to do state ends like the local debt for equity swaps, the corporate debt for equity swaps, which are now adding significantly to their balance sheets. But the bigger problem, I think, is what you mentioned, which is the shadow banking area and the smaller banks. At this point, and maybe you have different numbers, but it's 50% of the credit flows are shadow banking, and the smaller banks, if you add them in, about 70% of the entire financial system is essentially not the banks that you're talking about. And I agree with you. I mean, my colleagues at the Bank of China, I could see that they were making a valiant effort to try to clean up what they were doing, and I think that's absolutely true. But if you've got 70% of the economy essentially run with anywhere from small, badly run banks to mom and pop shops handing out credit like candy, and if there's such demand for credit among local governments and corporates and the rest of it, it's not clear that the state's going to be able to control any of this stuff down the road. And I hate to be one of those bears, but what the heck.
I think I agree with most everything you say. What I would say is that the shadow banking is being addressed now, and I think over the next few years, first of all, shadow banking is not per se a bad thing. A lot of good innovation comes out of it. It's also a wonderful safety valve when the big banks are forbidden to lend to real estate companies and to local banks. You still have to let them breathe somehow or another, so they go into the shadow banking system and they borrow at a higher interest rate. And it focuses their mind a bit. But in my book, which I really finished writing a year ago, I said starting 2 or 3 years ago, I was thinking the Chinese government should be doing something about shadow banking. I think they should have moved earlier, so I agree with you. But as so often in China, they do eventually move, and they're pretty effective in moving. And I'm pretty confident, given what Xi Jinping came out and said in that April speech nationwide, and given what came out of the once every 5-year financial brainstorming session at top level, they're serious about this, and they will clean it up. And, well, you and I agree on small banks, and I just saw the numbers, was done in an excellent paper by UBS. The construction bank, banks like this, have almost no exposure to shadow banking, very little dependence on it. The banks in Jilin and Heilongjiang, it's getting close to 85%. I mean, there's just this enormous difference. And of course, your remarks on lending to mom and pop stores, I couldn't agree more. I was saying that in the board of directors. And I don't think Chinese fully understand that yet. And I don't think the regulators do. And I think also in the government, I was often told by government people, you bankers should be lending more aggressively to the small and medium-sized enterprises. That's high-risk stuff. And some of it's going to go bad, no question. So I think we pretty much agree with each other.
Okay, Jim will be here after the speech. His book is on sale. Can you just all please give Jim a very warm welcome? And thank you.